Hey everyone, welcome to Prove Your Impact, brought to you by the Bob Woodruff Foundation and the Armed Services Arts Partnership, or ASAP. My name is Sam Pressler and I am the founder of ASAP. We're a nonprofit based in the Mid-Atlantic region of the United States, and what we do is cultivate community and growth with veterans, service members, and military families through the arts. So essentially what that looks like is we offer classes, workshops, performances across an array of art forms, from stand-up comedy to improv to storytelling, creative writing, the visual arts, and everything in between. And what we're focused on is providing a place for veterans to have social support, a place to build skills, and ultimately a place to improve your well-being through the community arts. We are here today to talk about a study that we've been working on for the last 3 years, our program impact evaluation. It was an 18-month mixed methods evaluation, which we'll describe a little bit more throughout this conversation. That was really honed in on understanding the elements of our programs that affected and improved the well-being and the outcomes of veterans, service members, and their families. And I think the purpose for today is to explore the process that we followed for the design and implementation of this study, as well as our key findings in order to draw out the lessons learned and potentially implications for other veteran serving organizations. One key theme throughout this entire study was the importance of really comprehensive stakeholder buy-in. It wasn't just a top-down decision from our team that we were going to do research. It really involved all of our stakeholders, from our funders and the Bob Woodruff Foundation, to our board members, to our staff, to our community of veterans, service members, and their families. And today I'm really excited to have representatives from all of those stakeholder groups joining me in this conversation. So I'd love to introduce our conversation partners, our panelists, and maybe Dr. Margaret Harrell, would you like to kick us off?
Sure. Hi, I'm Meg Harrell. I'm an Army brat and a Navy wife, and in my heart of hearts, I'm really a researcher. I spent 25 years at the RAND Corporation studying service members and their families and veterans, really the people issues associated with the military. Following that, I served in a senior position in the Pentagon as part of the Obama administration. And now I'm at the Bob Woodruff Foundation, where I'm the Chief Program Officer. I've been there almost 4 years. The Bob Woodruff Foundation, or BWF, finds, funds, and shapes evidence-based programs to ensure that veterans and their families continue to thrive after their military service. So that's what I bring to this conversation. So thank you, Sam, for including me.
Thanks for joining. Maureen, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Thanks all for tuning in today. My name is Maureen Elias. I am a U.S. Army veteran as well as a military spouse, and I am an ASAP alumni. I'm a proud graduate of the storytelling, improv, and comedy stand-up workshops. Really excited to be here today.
I think Maureen may hold the record or close to the record for most ASAP programs participated in, so we're grateful for you joining us. And last but not least, Terry Tinelian.
Hi, thanks, Sam, and hi, everybody. Thanks so much for tuning in. My name is Terry Tinelian, and I'm a psychologist. I'm a daughter of a U.S. Navy veteran, and I have spent about 25 years doing research on mental health issues, and particularly focused on understanding the impact of deployments and combat exposures on our service members, veterans, and their families. And I had the opportunity to serve on the Armed Services Arts Partnership Board. And so have seen from that view kind of the importance of bringing evaluation into the program.
Awesome. Well, thank you all. Really excited to get in this conversation. Before we do, I have a few very 2020 specific PSAs just to kick us off. So first, things don't always go as planned. I'm currently in California, and with the heat and wildfires, power has been going out. So if my power goes out, ASAP's executive director, Brian Jenkins, will fill in for me. He's awesome. We'll also cross my fingers that I can follow through on this conversation. Second, if any of the panelists are having any connection problems, they may turn their videos off and go audio only to maintain connection. And third, this is more fun and exciting. We know there's a lot of y'all listening in. So we're gonna have 15 minutes of Q&A at the end. And so to submit your questions for Q&A, please send them on Twitter. If you've heard of it, and you do that throughout the event. You can send it to ASAP's Twitter account. That's at ASAP_vets, at ASAP_vets. That is our PSAs. Let's dive into this conversation. So I'm going to start just by maybe grounding us in where ASAP began as an organization and the role that research played in our very early days. So on a very personal level, I founded ASAP based on slight research projects that I was doing around veterans issues as an undergrad at William & Mary. And I was very fortunate to take the student organization on which I was working as an undergrad and be able to have funding to turn it into a real nonprofit. So when I started that organization in 2015 and I was sharing my goals with others, I always noted that conducting research on our impact was very much core to our strategy, even before we really had much funding or anything really to speak to. But despite these aspirations, I quickly found out that it was easier said than done to do research. This research takes time, it takes expertise, takes money. And at that time, I felt like I didn't, and we as an organization didn't have any of that. And I think, it was in these early days with Terry and Meg, where I met you both at different times. And I'm just interested to kick us off from your perspective, maybe Terry, to start with you. Where was ASAP when we first met?
Gosh, you're taking me back several years. Certainly, I think one of the interesting opportunities I've had in my career is the ability to meet several individuals who have developed programs or constructed new interventions or thought about launching organizations designed to support our military families and veterans. And one of the things that impressed me was that, you had done your homework and had really looked at the literature and tried to understand the role that the arts could play in improving quality of life. But also we're really interested in understanding how you could assess and measure that impact. And unlike several others that I have met who were convinced they had a cure, you were more open to the idea of learning whether and how the programs and the activities of the organization were impacting and affecting the lives of those who participated. So while it was a very young and small organization, I think that commitment to the ability to learn whether or not and how you were affecting the lives of service members, veterans, and their families was really remarkable. And, as you acknowledged, doing research can be challenging. And, the first goal, really, the first important thing I think I would say is having the intention. And you had the intention. And I think that was really a key attribute to success. Thanks.
Meg, we first met, was it like 2016, 2017, I'm interested, what was your first perspective or first impression of ASAP as an organization when we came to you, expressing potential interest in a partnership?
Yeah, it was very similar to that Terry described. I mean, you were a really young organization. And Sam, one of the things that really struck me and my team, I think, was that you didn't oversell, right? You knew what you knew, but you also were willing to talk a lot about what you didn't know yet. So you knew there was an evidence base there for the arts, but there wasn't really research about the arts and their impact on the military veteran community, which, veterans are people too, but in some ways they are, unique and they have their differences. And you were really candid about what you still needed to learn. One of the things we observed was that you had surrounded yourself with really smart people. Terry was on your board. There were several other people on your board that we held in really high esteem. And it was clear not only that you were smart enough to form a good board, but that you were really listening to them. And that was really important to us, that you were willing to learn, you were willing to listen, and you were really set off on what was, the journey to come with your evaluation.
Yeah, it was one of those things that I always felt really grateful, being someone who I think at the time was like 23, 24, having so many incredibly talented and also just generous people around who believed in what we could be doing, but also held me accountable and the organization accountable to researching that. And that kind of leads me to a follow-up question. Once we started having these conversations and thinking about what a research project could look like, what building a study could look like. Meg, you were representing more on the funder side. Terry, you were as a board member. How did you guys experience that process? What was that process like for y'all as we started to build out the potential study together?
Well, I'll jump in. Sam, I was struck by a lot of things that you were doing right. I see a lot of organizations that want to, learn how they're doing, evaluate their program, but don't really recognize the right way to do such an evaluation. And you weren't making this up from scratch, right? So you were already at that point talking about engaging the experts, using the right researchers, using methods that were well established, and questions, scales that were already established. Even in the early days, we could tell that you had the intent to approach this in a really rigorous way.
I would add that from the board's perspective, I think the financial realities were ones that we were really concerned with, because clearly we needed to think about how we could dedicate funding and leverage funding opportunities like with the Bob Woodruff Foundation, but also not detract from the ability to implement the programs, because that really was kind of where the rubber meets the road and being able to host these classes. And so making sure that from a board's perspective, that you had the commitment of the entire team to be able to embark upon this, because the resources were available, because we had a great research team that you could count on, and that it wasn't really going to disrupt the operations.
Mm-hmm. And I just to, I think, add on that, the thing that I appreciated about the process as we worked through it together was, from the Bob Woodruff Foundation side, it felt very iterative. Like it felt like we weren't early on thinking about funding. We were like just partnering with you on, hey, how can we potentially build a study on this work? And the feedback that y'all offered over the course of a year and a half really felt instrumental to the ultimate research design that we landed on. And I think, Terry, same goes with you, having you as a board member and having those calls in the early days of thinking through what the design looked like. It wasn't, we built the perfect thing and then rolled it out. It was this kind of back and forth process that we had over the course of, and I think it's important to underscore this was over the course of a year or more to get to the point where we were ready to actually put a study out there. So I guess this one's for you, Meg. I'm interested in if there are any kind of key takeaways or lessons learned for funders, nonprofits, nonprofit board members to just apply from this initial approach of working together.
Well, I think that one of the things that really, struck us about UCM was that you came to us with a collaborative approach. It wasn't a hard sell. You were more than willing to admit what you didn't know, but you were also candid about the resources that you needed, and you were realistic about the resources that you were going to receive, likely, right, to learn what you needed to learn and to get better. And it was clear in your approach that your motivation for doing the study was to improve your programming. It wasn't to prove that you'd been right all along. It was to improve your programming and ensure your impact.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think we should, we can maybe transition to, okay, what did this study actually look like? How did we put it together? And so I just want to speak a little bit to the research design that I alluded to in the beginning, just to kind of set the scene here. So as I mentioned, we used a mixed methods design, which means it included quantitative data and qualitative data. And I think for us, one of the key reasons we decided on this was it allowed us to assess our outcomes quantitatively and then expand on them with that qualitative data. And it also enabled us to potentially identify key findings or learnings that we really couldn't have captured alone through the quantitative scales, because this was our first time doing something like this, and we were open to new information. So on the quantitative side, just to walk through this briefly, we basically had surveys before our 7-week classes that were distributed to all participants who opted in, and surveys completed after graduating from those 7-week classes. Then after that, the participants received a 3-month follow-up survey, which they completed, and a 6-month follow-up survey, which they completed. And that was for all participants in our 2018 classes that we offered. We also, and I think this is very important, and something that Terry and Meg, I know you really emphasize, is the importance of having a comparison group. So we put together a comparison group that was comprised of veterans, service members, and military family members who were set to enroll in our spring 2019 classes. And then in the fall of 2018, they actually completed pre and post surveys at the same time intervals as our fall 2018 program participants. And the final element of the quantitative strand was surveys of all audience members at our graduation shows. So I think we had over, by the end, when it was all said and done, 755 audience surveys completed from folks who attended those shows. On the qualitative side, just to briefly walk through that, we did a combination of interviews and focus groups with pretty much every stakeholder group affiliated with our program. So we talked in focus groups with our class participants, we talked with their family members and caregivers, we talked with our teaching artists in the focus groups, and we even held focus groups with audience members at our performances. And all of this came together to provide a fairly robust mixed methods approach. And now, Maureen, I do want to bring you in. So you were on the receiving end of a lot of these surveys. You know, it's one thing to put it together; it's another thing to have to go through it. What was that experience like for you? Was it overwhelming? Or like, was it manageable? Like, how did you just experience being on the receiving end of this study?
Sure. You know, it was interesting because. I went through storytelling when we didn't have the surveys, and then I went through improv when we had the surveys. And I wouldn't say it was overwhelming, because it wasn't. In fact, it was almost a bit of a blessing, especially with the qualitative part of it, because so me, my husband, and a couple of the friends I developed from the class got to participate in the qualitative part of it. And we sat around eating and drinking at a restaurant while we answered these questions. And what was beautiful about it was, you know, with storytelling, I went through the class, I learned the skill check, and then I've applied it in my life. But with improv, and because we did the qualitative study, I really had time to recognize the impact that such a simple 6-week class had on my entire life. I think, you know, one of my big aha moments for me was my husband, who had been deployed to Afghanistan and come back a little more serious than before he left, while we were in improv together, smiled for the first time in years, like really enjoyed himself. And so but I didn't really realize how much that impacted me until we went through those qualitative questions and really talked about what that process meant to us and felt like to us.
So one thing that's really interesting that we didn't think was going to happen, but it actually aligns with what you said, is the folks who participated in the focus groups actually felt like expressed feeling more ownership of the program and like ownership of the study. So just as like a fun fact, we did a community launch event around the study a few weeks ago, and we had close to 100 members of our community tune into that call because they were so excited about their participation in the study. So I think it's important to think about this not necessarily as something that like is extractive from the community, but rather something that provides community with ownership and influence of the programs that you're designing. And I think you very much speak to that there. I think maybe turning to Meg and Terry, and one of you guys can jump in as you see fit, but I'm interested in, you know, you guys have significant experience with designing and implementing evaluations. You both really informed our research design. So what did y'all see as unique about our approach? And why was the research design that we ended up using that you both informed so important?
So I'll jump, and I alluded to this a little bit before, but you didn't start from scratch. You didn't make it up on your own. You didn't create your own questions. Instead, you took a really rigorous approach to what is it that you wanted to learn. And, at the risk of sounding a little bit research geeky, right? You used the DRS 15 scale, which, for those that aren't researchers, that's the dispositional resiliency scale. And it actually puts to actual words and concepts what is meant by resiliency. So commitment, control, challenge, those are all aspects that were really relevant to your program, and it's what you set out to measure.
Yeah, I would add, I mean, not only did, the survey instrument rely upon measures that had been validated and had been used in other populations, but the mixed methods approach, I think, was essential. The ability to not only gather the data in a quantitative way so that you could look at changes over time, but that you also gathered that qualitative information to help interpret it and to give it some context and to really bring out some of those themes. The other important aspect that often is missing from other program evaluations is that longer term follow-on. And so typically what people do for evaluation is they just do a post-completion survey and check they did an evaluation. But the opportunity that you had to gather information at 3 months and then at 6 months, I think, was essential to kind of allow time to see how participation may have influenced those participants in ways that maybe they didn't recognize as soon as the class ended, as even Maureen kind of reflected in her comments. And then the comparison group was essential. The opportunity that, to leverage the fact that you had people on a wait list, but you could gather information to provide that opportunity to just compare and contrast change over time, because the change over time occurs regardless of participating in a program, but having a comparison group allowed you to differentiate that change between participants and non-participants. So all of those, as Meg said, we can research geek out, were kind of essential for ensuring the rigor. But also something that you said was that this wasn't just to be able to generate new knowledge, it was to generate the knowledge in the context of continually improving your programs in ways that you could continue to ensure your value and your impact.
You guys said it better than I ever could. I'm grateful to have you on this call. So I want to transition a little bit into the key findings from the study, which I know for me it was, I really had no expectations around it. So when we really started to get into the analysis, I was just so excited by not only kind of maybe confirmation of some of our hypotheses, but also the new things that we learned from the combination of the quantitative and qualitative data. Before I jump into this, I just want to make my second PSA. If you have questions, tweet them at us. I've never really tweeted before, but I hear it's the cool thing to do. So to ASAP's Twitter account at ASAP_vets, and we'll be getting to them in a few minutes. So before I ask a few questions around the key findings, I want to just outline what they were at a fairly high level. So I'm going to focus in on the key findings for the participants, that is the veteran service members, military family members, and caregivers in ASAP's programs. So we had 5 kind of key findings from the quantitative and qualitative data. The first was improvements in well-being. And we found that this was driven by significant increases in confidence, self-esteem, and social connections, as well as decreases in stress and depression. The second key finding that Meg briefly alluded to is increases in resilience. And again, this was driven by increases in commitment, which is defined in the DRS scale as the tendency to see life as meaningful, and control, which is defined as the belief that you can control or influence the events in your life. Then we saw increases in skills. And so this was interesting because it was both the direct artistic skills from the class, so learning how to perform stand-up comedy, but also the translatability of these direct and indirect skills to the family, social, and professional relationships. The fourth one was increases in sense of belonging. This was both inside the classroom with the classmates and instructors, and outside of the classroom with the broader community. And an interesting point on this was the sense of belonging actually directly drove participants to complete the classes and overcome the anxiety of getting on stage and everything, because they were part of that community. And the final finding for participants is what we call integration of self. And we define this as the process of learning to accept, honor, and integrate your life experiences and stories as an integral part of yourself. And just to make this tangible, just with some examples, for some, this actually meant acknowledging like formerly suppressed elements of their identity as veterans. So, I never saw combat, so I never wanted to identify as a veteran, and actually acknowledging that no, their veteran military experience is part of their identity. And for others, this meant expanding beyond the identity of a service member, a veteran military family member, and viewing yourself as an artist, a teacher, a volunteer, and more. And just to kind of underscore these outcomes, I think tying this back to the research design, they were statistically significant because of our ability to have the quantitative skills in our sample size. We were able to prove or understand that they were a result of program participation because of the comparison groups, and because of our longitudinal 3 and 6 month surveys, we were able to see that these outcomes sustained for the alumni who continue to participate in the arts or who continue to engage with their fellow veterans after the class. So just wanted to lay that out there for grounding on when we start to talk through these findings. Maureen, I'd love to start with you on this and come back to you. I know you started to speak to this a little bit about you and your husband. Could you speak a little bit more to your experience with ASAP? Like, how do these findings align with your experience as a fellow alumni? Were any of these surprising to you? What was your thoughts after hearing that?
I mean, I never thought of them in this way, but reading every single one of them is that, aha, oh yeah, check, 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 check. The participating in the ASAP programming has completely kind of changed the way that I operate and the narrative that I use in my life. I thought that learning how to do storytelling and learning how to do improv were just kind of fun skills, but I have used those skills every day in my life ever since. The focus on being present and accepting what others giving to you in a conversation versus just listening so you can reply. In the military, sometimes you can end up feeling very, very aggressive and defensive. That's just kind of your mentality because we've been at war, for 19 years. And this gave us the opportunity to kind of take off that armor, be a little bit more vulnerable and be a part of what's happening in the room. I was always really impressed by watching someone who would come in and you could see that they were kind of closed off and tense and anxious. And as we go through the warm-up exercises, which are extremely uncomfortable, but also a lot of fun, you would watch that onion layer peel and peel until, their shoulders relaxed and they were smiling and engaged in the conversation. And then, the friends, so my first class that I took was storytelling. And I was sharing a story that was very, very personal and vulnerable to me. And that was the story about the day my third child was diagnosed with autism, the third of 3 children diagnosed with autism. And because of the way the class is laid out and the way that the instructors helped us peel those onions, we were all able to share those very vulnerable stories with each other. And the healing that comes just from sharing that story is so amazing. And I think that's part of the reason you see some of the, increases in resilience, because if we can speak our truths, we're just freer people. And then, like you mentioned, as a woman veteran who was not in combat, that's not always an identity I've always strongly put out there. But especially within the ASAP community, it's something that I now take pride in and is one of the first things I say when I talk about who I am. And then the skills themselves, I work in an advocacy position. So, storytelling skills are our power, right? Data makes us credible, stories make us memorable. And so all of these findings that you found, I absolutely am not surprised at, and 100% am excited to see, that that's what this showed, because that's the impact it's had on my life.
That's awesome. Well, Maureen, thank you. Thank you for sharing. I also want to thank you for joining us. I know you squeezed us in really tight between work commitments, so I know you have to step off in a minute. But thank you for kind of sharing your experience with the study, with the program, and just offering that up for everyone on this conversation.
My pleasure. Thanks.
All right. So, Meg, I'm interested first with you to hear, you kind of maybe had some expectations going in of what some of the findings might be. You've seen a lot of these programs. What stood out for you? What surprised you? And kind of how did you kind of experience these findings once you started to read them?
Sure. And you know what, although I'm going to rebel a little bit, Sam, and answer a slightly different question, which is what didn't surprise me, right? So there were some findings that, thank goodness they were your findings, your skills, for example. If you're running an improv training class or a storytelling training class, like, your findings should show that when people complete it, they can do those things better than they could initially, right? Or like, why are you there? So there were some things that weren't surprising at all. I personally didn't think the belonging and the commitment findings were surprising because, if somebody's going to get through an improv class, like, it's because they have the commitment to do it. And it's because the group makes them want to come back. So not surprising, but nonetheless really important. One of the things that we're really learning from, people in general, but veterans especially, is that the need to belong is super critical. And at the foundation, we published some work soon after the pandemic began that really emphasized that although social distancing may be the smart thing to do during a pandemic, it's potentially really harmful to people that have mental health issues. And so belonging and feeling that connection is really important. So those findings weren't surprising, but they're super, super important. But, to what was surprising, I think your enduring effects on stress and on self-esteem and on depression, like, those were, I think, really surprising, and at the same time, just so incredibly important and almost astounding that would come out of, an arts program for those of us that, didn't know as much about arts going into it as you did. Those are findings that I think are just really worth underscoring.
I appreciate that. And I mean, I think frankly, my background as kind of a non-artist, I had the same skepticism starting out as you did, which was, and I saw the anecdotal kind of impact of it, and which made me really energized to do this study, to like, hey, how do we make tangible what we're seeing and what we're hearing? Because I do think, when you say, oh, you're doing a comedy program for veterans or an improv program for veterans, like, there is this element of like, oh, is that just a nice feel-good activity, right? Like, you get to get on stage, you get a pat on the back, and you're done. And what we were seeing, kind of to what Maureen was speaking to, is like, this is something that actually is making meaningful differences in people's lives, and not only changing their experience in the moment, but changing how they approach the world moving forward. And so, like, it's very much aligned with the kind of skepticism, but also being able to have this research to maybe talk to some of the non-believers about the impact of this program. I guess, Terry, for you, you got to see this, throughout the process. Was there anything that stood out? Did this meet all of your expectations? Like, how did you kind of experience the findings?
Yeah, well, like Meg, I don't know that I was particularly surprised by anything, but, I am a data person. And so just like the title of today, I was like, prove it. I hear the stories, I can, understand the anecdotes. I understand the importance of kind of the group process that can happen when you bring the community together for some of these classes. I had attended some of the graduation and some of the performances. And so I'd seen kind of the results, if you will, of participants getting through the classes, but I'm a big show me the data, prove it. And so it was really nice to see kind of it bear out. And again, I wasn't necessarily surprised, although some of the findings, around the long-term impact with depression and things like that were reassuring to see, but as Meg kind of explained, understandable based upon what we were also seeing with some of the other results and what we know about the program. But as a board member, you know, the board was taking a risk, right? We were saying, yeah, sure, we're going to, you know, gather this data. We're going to be transparent. We're going to publish the results. And, you know, you hope that it comes out in a positive way. And you think about how are we going to use this information to tell our story better and to kind of, you know, build the brand and not just contribute to the knowledge base of what we understand of how we can help service members, veterans, and their families. But how does it help the organization grow? And mean for scaling what it is that we're doing? And so trying to think about how to use the results in that context too, I think was important as a board member.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, Sam, can we turn that back to you and ask what you thought was surprising?
Yeah. So I think for me, it was not so much any of the themes, but the strength of it, right? I had, when I started, like made this, like put a kind of stake in the ground that it wasn't about like the, you know, the individual experience of like a one-time workshop or a one-time class. It was providing the continuity of engagement and creating avenues so that when you, like basically the way we developed our veteran journey, our service members journey, was that the graduation from class was the start of your experience with ASAP. And I think to see, and what I mean by that is like when you graduate from a class with ASAP, you can continue on in our community programming, in our workshops, in our performances. You can continue on in the partner programming of the arts organizations with whom we partner in the community, or you can get trained up to become a volunteer in the community. You can become an alumni mentor, and eventually you could become a lead instructor of our classes. Most of our classes are now taught by the veterans who've graduated from our programs. And so I think what I was most surprised by in a positive way was how sustained the results were. And that felt that it was a validation of the program model that we put together. And I mean, I think for me, when I talk to veterans organizations or really any nonprofits, I ask this question of like, what comes next? Like that intervention is great, but what comes after that intervention? And I think this starts to speak to the importance of having those avenues for continued engagement in the thing that, you know, you believe is improving people's well-beings or facilitating the outcomes that you are developing. Yeah, that's me. So I think we started to talk a little bit about this, but I want to get to the implications, both for ASAP, but also just more broadly, like thinking through the implications of building a study like this. So let me just start by highlighting what I think the key implications were. And Terry, you started to speak to this a little bit, but first it was establishing ASAP as a learning organization. A key element of this study was that a desired output, and I know we put this in the grant application for the Bob Woodruff Foundation, was developing a monitoring and evaluation system based on that study, so that when we finish the study, we can continue to assess the quality of our programs and ensure that we were continuing to meet the desired outcomes that we were achieving. And when we weren't, we were able to adjust. That was the first thing, I think, really critical output of this. The second was as a learning organization, having the ability to strengthen and refine our impact. So one of the things that came out of this was that the value of sustained engagement with fellow veterans, with the arts more broadly. And so based on the results of these studies, we actually built more arts partnerships in the community. We created more avenues for veterans who've graduated from our programs to continue to engage with our organization in volunteer capacities and advisory capacities and teaching capacities. And that, again, served to reinforce the outcomes and impact that we were seeing. And then I think most relevant to now, and as I've transitioned to founder, I haven't been able to experience the benefits of this as much, but the ability of increasing ASAP's adaptability and scale. So with COVID hitting, one thing that Brian and the programs team really had to work through was transitioning an entirely in-person experience in classes, in performances, to a virtual setting. And that's essentially like building a new organization in a sense. And by having the monitoring and evaluation system in place, we can do that and learn from that in an iterative way so that we can continue to hone in this very new programmatic environment. So that, I think, for us were the key implications of the program, or of doing the study. I think, Terry, I'm interested kind of as we broaden out these implications to, I know you don't like the word the space, but veteran serving organizations, the sector, how you think about distinguishing between, this idea of like collecting data and conducting an evaluation, and why is that important?
Yeah, well, so, we talk about the intentionality here, right? And I think over time we've seen the recognition that funders in particular, as well as members of the population want to know what the impact is. And so there's been an increased desire by organizations to collect information and data about who they serve and kind of, generate the impact statement around the outputs, for example, like the number of individuals that they've trained or their number of events that they've hosted. And so while it's been great to see that more and more organizations are collecting data, the distinction I make with conducting an evaluation is that idea that you have to be purposeful and very specific with a methodology and an approach that's going to allow you to collect data and analyze it and then interpret it to understand what it tells you about your work and what the implications are for continuing to improve your programs. And so it's not just about collecting a bunch of data and arraying some infographics. It's about having a purposeful design and methodology that enables you to do so in a way that's going to ultimately help you understand if and how you're affecting outcomes that matter for the stakeholders in your community, but then, what to do with it based upon that. And, I think learning organizations really do differentiate themselves because they have made a commitment to that continual improvement, and that you use the information you collect and reflect upon it in a way that helps you change or, invest more deeply in an area where you think you can have impact. So, again, I think it's about this intention and design and how you go about it. But I think one of the implications, Sam, that of the study also is I think you've demonstrated that even for a small organization, doing this is feasible and has value. And so I think it sets an example for other veteran serving nonprofits that this was an important investment. It was affordable. It was supported by a funding organization, and it's going to reap long-term benefits for the organization.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And Meg, from the funder perspective, from the partner on this, from day one, what were your takeaways and the kind of implications? Why are evaluations like this important? How do you think about this in terms of the bigger picture?
Well, I think these evaluations continue to be really important to make those potential adjustments. As a funder, at the foundation, our mission is to ensure that veterans continue to thrive. It's not just to do good and to make grants. In other words, like many for-profit businesses, we're interested in our return on investment, and our return on investment is impact. And so when we're working with an organization like ASAP, even though you were small, this evaluation permitted you to be able to both qualify and quantify our return on investment, that grant that we provided you. And knowing that you were willing to learn and willing to adjust in order to increase your impact, which again, in business terms is my ROI, was something that was really important to us.
Well, I think this will wrap up the internal conversation part of this discussion. We're now getting a lot of at ASAP_vets. I'm going to take the first one because it's something I've been thinking about as we're discussing. This has definitely been a rosy conversation. And so there is a question, what challenges did you encounter, if any, in conducting this research. And I'll start. Terry, if you have any that come to mind as I'm talking, please please jump in. I will start from the beginning. I think, frankly, getting the funding to do this. I knew I wanted to do a study for ASAP in 2015, and we didn't get the funding support to do it as we build the relationship with the Bob Woodruff Foundation until the end of the end of 2017, I believe. So that's a 2-year time period in which we were committing to doing something that we were not yet able to do. So I think that is one. I think thinking about the actual implementation of this, like just from a programmatic drag perspective, it is a lot of work for your program teams to deliver surveys, follow up on surveys, ensure we got the response rate that we did on the surveys. So I would say we probably added another 10% to 15% of staff time just to do this, right? So it is an investment of programmatic staff time. And then I think, as we were getting to the rollout, and I'll just be very honest, we were right about to launch the results of the study, and then COVID hit. And so how do the implications of a study like this apply in an environment that is now completely different, right? When we don't know when we're going to go back in person, when we don't know what the kind of real world implications of this research will be. So I am always concerned about presenting an overly positive picture of things because, as Terry knows well, I tend to be a critical person, and there were a lot of challenges. I will state, and I'll close here, that despite those challenges, this was the most important thing we did for the organization. Like, to be able to understand our impact, demonstrate our impact, and be able to build on that as an organization that's taking outside funding, just to me, it has to be foundational. So I wouldn't change the decision, but it was not a breeze by any means.
Hey, Sam, can I go back to something you just said there?
Yeah.
My program officers and I at the foundation, even just today, we're talking about response rates and how when you're doing a program evaluation, you need your participants to respond at a really high level, much higher than people think of it in research surveys. If you do a research survey, you can get a relatively small proportion of people to respond and you can still extract significant findings. But in evaluation, you really need the buy-in of your participants. Can you talk a little bit about how you got that buy-in, how you got that response rate? Because we see all the time organizations that, try to survey their participants and they get relatively small, proportions of response.
That's a really good question. And I want to be as honest as my recollection offers on it. So I think first and foremost, we invited our community in to be part of the research design process. So we actually conducted, and I didn't include this, but we conducted a pre-focus groups before the study to get input on the actual design and delivery of the study. And that was about both informing what it looked like, but also actually achieving the feeling that you have a part of this, right? So I think that was first. I think second, the nature of our classes being free and accessible created a feeling of kind of, they invest, ASAP invested in me, and the least I can do is complete this survey. And we very much, accountability is a huge element and a value in our program. And I think this mutual accountability kind of shown through in the survey completion. And then I think third, and I think it just can't be overemphasized, is we were just relentless in our follow-up. And we made sure that we got people to complete the study, even if it meant 4 or 5 follow-ups. We eventually got some funding to offer Amazon gift cards for everyone who completed the 3 and 6 month surveys. And I think that, and don't fully quote me on this, but I think that led to our 6-month survey response rate being at or above 80%. So we were able to really get people to follow through over a fairly long period of time. We have a lot more questions coming in, so I might throw a few more at you, at you both. So this one I think is for the group. Someone asked this interesting question: what would have happened next if the findings showed little or no impact? What are the next steps, and if an evaluation does not demonstrate any impact?
Do you want to start, Meg, or do you want me to take it?
Go ahead, because I think it's actually most important from the perspective of the leadership of the organization.
Yeah, well, at first, you have to then kind of look at, how good was your evaluation? So if the findings don't bear the fruit that you hope they do, you first have to go back and assess, well, did we have good response rates? Did we get, were our measures appropriately sensitive? Were we measuring the right things? What did the qualitative data tell us that might help explain why we didn't see something? Was there a problem in the implementation of the programs? So, basically you want to make sure that first you can trust the data. If you can trust the data, then it might suggest that perhaps there's something misaligned between your intervention and the outcomes that you're measuring. Perhaps you're measuring the wrong types of outcomes, or perhaps the intervention needs to be tweaked. If really what you're trying to drive towards is those outcomes, you need to think about some changes to the program and how the program is structured. And so, if we had seen that, it would have probably meant that we would have to do a deeper dive and try to unpack why we weren't seeing some of the findings that we had expected or that hoped for. And certainly to then make the course corrections that would be necessary. And then to reassess and reevaluate and see if that turned it around.
And from a funder's perspective, right, we had made the investment. So I think if we had learned that the investment, that ASAP wasn't successful, I think we would have had to rethink through our process and our logic, because what compelled us to the investment was an evidence base that was not specific to the military veteran population. And I think we would have wanted to engage a little bit to understand why that disconnect, why something that was evidence-based in a broader population was appearing in your evaluation not to be evidence-based for the veteran community. So I think there would have been some learning there that we would have wanted to engage in with you.
And a question just to follow up on that is, not having results doesn't mean to abandon, right? It doesn't mean to abandon doing the research, abandon having a monitoring evaluation. It's really a call to action to, think about how using those results to understand how to improve what you're doing moving forward.
I think that's true from an organizational perspective,
yeah.
But the hard truth as a funder, right, is that I'm evaluating different types of programs and where investments should lie. So I'm not saying that we would have abandoned ASAP, but I think we would have probably changed our level of investment and prioritized other things that were more evidence-based, while staying in touch with you to understand what you were learning and how you were retooling.
Absolutely. Yeah. And even just to underscore that, I remember we had an early phone call where we were talking about funding something else before the study. And you were very frank. You said without this study, without having an ability to understand your impact, we couldn't have the confidence to invest in what you were doing. And so it was very much dependent on having that information, and from your perspective, positive information in improving veterans' well-being.
That certainly makes it easier to invest.
So there are a lot of really interesting questions here. We have about 7 more minutes. I'm going to take 2 quick ones that I think I can knock out pretty quickly. So one, they asked, did the study survey active duty in addition to veterans? How did the outcomes differ, if at all? So this question, good question. I should have mentioned up front, when I say veterans, it's become a shorthand for veterans, service members, military family members, and caregivers. So everyone in the ASAP community, veterans, service members, active duty and reserve, military family members defined as anyone over the age of 18, in a military family because just for IRB reasons, and then caregivers of veterans and service members were all involved in the study. There were no differences in outcomes across those groups. This is a guess, but from my experience, we are doing a community-based intervention that is focused on kind of broad outcomes for a diverse population. And as such, we're not doing kind of a targeted intervention for combat veterans versus a targeted intervention for military families. And so that is kind of my take on that question. There is another question, I think, that could be for all of us. I'm interested, maybe Meg, since you have a 30,000-foot view of a lot of different veteran serving organizations, do you think there's anything about these findings that could be translatable to other skill-based programming for veteran and service members or families that are not focused on the arts?
I don't know, but I think your findings suggest some of the right questions that other organizations should be asking. So whether it applies, I think, will have to be proven out, but some good questions here.
I would agree with that. I think you have to take care not to overgeneralize from these findings because your model is very specific.
Mm-hmm.
Everything from how you train the teachers to kind of the community model that's used. And so you don't want to necessarily generalize these findings, but the types of questions and the outcomes that you were targeting could apply to other skills-based programs. And again, provide a model for how those organizations may want to assess, these types of programs that they're implementing.
And then we have one last audience question, which I think is actually an interesting one to close on. So they said, in a time when there is so much emphasis on direct assistance and resources to veterans in need, how can organizations balance immediate needs with the importance of these types of evaluations? How can they talk to their boards and other stakeholders about the need for both?
Well, I think you've got the basis of the answer there, right, Sam? It's a need for both.
Mm-hmm.
I know in our last grant cycle, we saw such an extraordinary need. We had well over 400 applications, over $35 million in requests. And a lot of that was for, food insecurity and families that were on the verge of homelessness. So, you have to address those urgent needs. It's sort of a Maslow hierarchy. But I think we can't neglect the fact that things like social connection and belonging and stress, and these are all part of the needs that need to be addressed. So we have to address needs at different levels.
I would add that I think that I also think there's an imperative that when we're using programs and interventions to address those needs, that we need to assess whether or not they're actually working. And whether it's demonstrating the ROI for a funder like the Bob Woodruff Foundation, or just ensuring you're not doing any harm and that you're actually producing the results, because we owe it to the population that we're trying to serve, kind of truth in advertising. Mm-hmm. And so again, it's kind of this prove your impact, be willing to understand whether or not what you did actually helped accomplish the goal that you set out to do. Whether that's providing, temporary help for an urgent acute need with food insecurity, or it's promoting a sense of belonging and community. We owe it to the population to make sure that we're providing to them is working. Yeah,
and I would just add, kind of from my seat, having run an organization like this is not, there is prioritization, but this one to me is not an either or, it's a both and, right? I really do believe that if you're trying to do work foundational to doing work for a community like the veteran community or any other population is understanding both the outcomes and the impact of that work, because you're asking for money for it. You're asking for support. Like, you need to be able to justify why. And I think that is key. And I think, this moment teaches us something, that it allows you to be able to adapt and prepare for the next challenge by having this in place so that you're not reacting. And so I think it's kind of instrumental to providing either direct or long-term support. I think that's a good place to close. Meg, Terry, thank you so much for joining. Thank you for offering your lunchtime this Wednesday. And I do really need to express a sincere gratitude to the Bob Woodruff Foundation for being partners on this work from when I was a starry-eyed, recent college graduate to now. This has been, as we said earlier, this hasn't been easy, but it's been so beneficial to build this partnership with you all. I'm just grateful to have this conversation here.
Well, Sam, your comments through this conversation, the lessons that you learned not just from the study, but more broadly from ASAP, have underscored why ASAP's been such a rewarding and delightful partner for us. Thank you for all that you've done.
Thanks, guys.